Hello there. I'm gonna do another approach on this one here, but the goal here isn't to actually pay attention to the run or to get to a specific score, but more to break down the different components that you will need if you are planning on actually doing Abyss 1. So there's a few things to keep in mind here. First, that damage reduction is, and this is probably the most important part, pretty much absolutely essential. Now, take a look at most of anyone who's doing this at a reasonable score. You have systematically, or almost, Furcy for AoE damage reduction. But not only, his wave is also pretty invaluable to actually surviving certain parts. Now, you can see there are some who do not use him. Chances are they're, to an extent, running Jiao Chan for some of that. But most of them will be using it, simply because that makes it vastly easier. One thing that is, however, a constant is one champion that will inflict damage reduction on the boss. This can be Volca, this can be Alistair, this can be technically if you have, say, give me a second. What's the easiest way to... I'm not going here, sorry. 2 minutes. If you have Phineas, and more importantly, if you have Phineas's exclusive, he puts damage reduction on the target, so he would technically work as well. I mean, theoretically, you could. There's some epics that do this as well, but let's not kid ourselves. They're epics. They're shit. It is also a candidate for this. Point is, reducing the damage of the boss is pretty freaking critical. And the final component to a lot of this is someone like Aelin, who will just provide... So, right, just one thing here. There's reduced damage taken. There is reduced AoE damage reduction. And then there is reduced damage directly on the boss. Where is it? Right there. So, you can probably drop 1 or 2 of these depending on your gear and your composition. But the more you have of these, the more likely you are to actually succeed here. Simply because the boss outputs a ridiculous amount of damage. That being said, doing so is severely hindering your damage. And if we go back here, most of these teams are running some form of damage booster. That can be Jiao Chan, that can be Durza. Durza also doubles as... damn it, where is it? I don't think it's listed as skills. But he does provide a damage reduction based on missing life to allies, which is pretty substantial. It can scale up to 70% damage reduction, which is absolutely massive. Like, couple that with the Furcy, and someone who is... There actually isn't someone who's reducing the damage on the boss, but if you did couple that with other people... Wait, why is Lyra here? Interesting. I guess just single target magic damage. Huh, now I'm curious. Sorry, give me a second. No, there has to be a valid reason for that. There's no way that Fibu is running Lyra if it's just for that. I'll look into that on my own time. But point is, right, you want some form of inspiration to scale your attack, and or accompanied by penetration in the case of Jiao Chan, or for Durza, I believe it's just attack speed and damage. He also applies vulnerabilities. Yeah, there we go. Lower than 70%, they also get a damage increase. But again, once more, these shields are the shields that the boss will be outputting, because just like all the Guild Boss 1 bosses, he does output shields, are absolutely massive, and the damage that you need is pretty ridiculous to actually get things done. Now, that's all well and good. You can survive, and you have damage buffs. That's great. That's going to probably eat up anywhere between 3 to 4 slots on your team, so you have 6 slots left. You're going to need a tank. Now, whether that's a Lord or someone like Constance who can eat the hits for you, it doesn't really matter. Point is, you will need a tank. The reason being that the boss sends in the Meteors, and the Meteors will absolutely destroy anyone who's not a tank. So, you will need one. That's all well and good. Which leaves you with, you know, somewhere between 5 and 6 slots where you need to make a choice. And you need to prioritize. So you need to go into this with the assumption that chances are you're not going to be clearing the whole thing, right? Let's just take another good look at our leaderboard here. These are people who are doing ridiculous amounts of damage on Guild Boss 2. These are accounts that are fully stacked. This gear is probably disgusting. You're not going to make the 60k. Your goal here is to just pass to the next shield. Now, depending on your gear and your account, what you could do is just pass, say, the first shield. And just focus on physical damage. And if you wanted to pass a second shield, you could have a somewhat weak physical damage for on like 2 units, but then strong magical damage to pass the second shield, and then again, basically choose how far you want to go and how many shields you want to break, and build your team around that concept. And only try to break specific shields. All this to say that you will need to make choices, and it really depends on your roster. Chances are, for now, what seems to work best are just Infernal and Nightmare. I think things can probably get done with Watchers also technically works, because, you know, you got Kigiri and Wukong in there, but I'm fairly certain that stuff can be run to a reasonable extent with MRes, but true damage seems to have been nerfed here. It is definitely not outputting what it should or could be outputting. So that's something that needs to be kept in mind when you're building your team, is if you're trying to go for Arbiters, you're going to get results that are not as good as you expect. And that's just kind of how it is. Point is, once you have dealt with all that, right, the actual fight happens, and I'm just going to use one of my recordings because it's a lot easier to actually go through the steps and pause at specific times. The boss will rotate through his 2 phases, and in each phase he will have the same attack patterns. He's going to have somewhat consistent AoE damage that's going to go out. That's reasonably fine, because your healers should be able to cover that without too much of an issue. However, he does a Bellow, like this, which in both phases will output an initial damage burst that will hurt, and then will output smaller ticks of damage as he continues his Bellow. I believe there's also a remnant effect. Like he's done with his Bellow, but it's still ticking damage for a while here, and it'll chain into the next ability, which here in this case, for the physical phase, he's going to slam the ground, deal big AoE damage to everyone, and everyone's going to be stunned. You want to make sure that everyone's full life before this happens. If they are not, if you don't have enough AoE damage, AoE healing, chances are someone will die, because the way this goes is, and this is the first phase, so right, you take 2 big hits, and you're stuck there for a while. Now, if you don't build anyone here with enough HP, they will drop to extremely low, and still be stunned, your healers will be stunned, and you will die. There's really no way around that. You need to A, make sure that you have some HP subs. A somewhat reasonable amount is at least above 20,000. You probably want to aim for a solid 25 to 30 with Lord boosted champions. Definitely aim above 30 if your champion is not Lord boosted. Once he does his slam, at least in physical phase, it's going to be that slam, he's going to do another Bellow. Same pattern as the first one, big AoE damage, followed by small little ticks that will come after. And in physical, this is where it's pretty much crucial to have a tank, and it's also critical to have someone next to the tank. He's going to cast the Meteor. The problem with the Meteor is if you don't have someone next to the tank takes the Meteor to the face and just instantly dies. Doesn't matter how you built your tank. I'm pretty sure it goes through unkillables like Torador has. It just flat out deletes your tank. No negotiation. That is only the case for physical. So the first Meteor hit lands. It's just, I believe it just does damage to the main tank. Then he drops those around the tank, and that will deal damage to all adjacent units, as well as the tank. If you do not have an adjacent unit at that point, your tank is dead. And then we have the shield phase, which will dragon shield phase, which then cues into a vulnerability phase. And that'll continue throughout the fight each time you go into physical. There's no real pattern changes that occur to the boss, it's just that. Then you go into the magic phase, which has slightly different attacks and slightly different requirements to make sure that you actually get through them. His Bellow is actually roughly the same. I believe the only real difference, let me just double check to make sure that I'm not talking to my ass. Yeah, it's basically the same thing. You're taking a big wipe of damage and then small little ticks as you go. Pretty much the same thing, although I believe that the small little ticks of damage last slightly longer. And the slam is different on physical. It's still roughly the same pattern, and you're getting AoE hits to everyone, but you're not getting stunned this time, so you can actually heal through them, which is a good time to potentially use some ult. And similar to physical, he's going to redo another Bellow, to then move on to his Meteor. Now, the Meteor for magical is, how to put this, somewhat atrocious, right? Because he calls in multiple waves of meteors that will once more deal damage to adjacent units, but this is some really messed up way of doing it. I'm pretty sure that they're based on maximum HP of the adjacent units, because it doesn't matter how I built whichever unit was next to him. I could go from 30 to 60,000 HP. That unit just got clapped. There was no significant improvement to how that unit survived. The unit just died. The only thing that more or less made the unit survive was essentially damage reduction from Aelin, Fersi, and Volca, as well as near-perfect timing of Fersi's ultimate. If you look at the damage hits that are going out here, right, you're taking significant damage each time one of those meteors land, and if your timings aren't right on whatever healer ults you have running, that unit is toast. See, like, I survived with almost nothing. That's a 65,000 HP Twyla with a Forsaken Key, because I was messing around and testing that. So, and she was getting roughly similar results in 40,000 HP. Like, it doesn't really matter. This unit next to the tank will take significant damage. Now, you have two choices here. You either summon the tank far away from any other units, but then you need to find a way to not have him just be deleted in phase 1, the physical phase, where the meteor will kill your tank. Or you can recall your unit that is next to the tank when you enter magical phase. Or you can mess around with healer ultimate timings and make the unit survive. Or I guess you could technically use Karn, so really there's maybe 4 solutions here. That being said, this is not necessarily easy to deal with, and this is probably a point where a lot of people just get really pissed. I know I know in our Discord a lot of people are complaining about this and just dying to meteors and not figuring out why. It's because it's kind of fucked. There's a lot of damage being output. There's no good way around it. It'll just happen. And, well, I mean, besides the ways I just described, like, you're not going to get a magic solution for this. So, that is essentially really just the entire moveset of the boss, and he will repeat that continuously, and obviously each time his damage will scale up, and his shields will scale up significantly. Now, you could, going back to the teams in themselves, you can actually get away with a fair amount of wiggle room in terms of gearing. Not for the HP subs, but you can go... Sorry, Twyla's a terrible example because she has penetration. You can run a crit damage piece or 2 depending on the champions. This is not Guild Boss 2. This is not a boss that has a bunch of defense. This is pretty similar in terms of gear not gear requirements, but the way you want to build your gear is like a hybrid between Guild Boss 2 and Guild Boss 1. You want to have that crit damage in there because you can afford it, and it gives you comparable or slightly more damage, and you want that HP subs. The bottom line is that there is kind of no magic trick that I know of as of now to Abyss 1. You can use some units like Kigiri or Wukong as well. Wukong would be for like if the clones are next to the tank when he does his meteors in the magic phase, that would absorb the hit for you and make it easier. And same concept for the physical phase, and then the magical phase you don't really care that the clones die because they're clones. Kigiri could tank some of the hits with his ultimate. So there's probably some others that exist that are capable of cheesing this, but they wouldn't output the same damage results as those two. Sadly, besides that, to mess with the meteors, there's not a lot of solutions that have really emerged. Like, again, when we're going back to the leaderboard, this is basically a have awakenings in gear, or content yourself with a lower score chest. That's really it. Right, so most of the people on this... There is actually a somewhat interesting low awakening team. But Sulkadins. So, you know, it's... You're gated by heroes pretty much 100% on this. At least for what we currently know. Here as well, reasonably low awakenings besides, you know, the A5 Ingrid, but hey, whatever. There are some teams that kind of make this work, but most of them are running just Sulk. There's some Yovars in there, but the Yovars are generally high awakenings. Once more, Sulkadins, Watcher with Ingrid. There are very few budget teams that will be able to get you to 20,000 plus. Sulkadins is meta now, which is, I guess, you know, is kind of, oh, actually this is interesting. I mean, you know, sure, A5 Kigiri and A3 Wukong, but there is a way to make this work actually reasonably well with... Where's your damage coming from? Interesting. I guess Pope and Ident are just enough to pass that second magic shield. Fair enough. You just need the absolutely insane damage on the physical shield. But yeah, there's very little wiggle room for choices. Like, some of these pieces are just constantly needed. Don't know if you've been looking at this much, but you know, Island, Furcy, and Diao Chan are pieces that come up on almost every single team. Again, some swaps are possible with Constance, or I'm pretty sure that's actually the only alternative to Diao Chan that I've seen in here. No, sorry, Durza, that's right. But yeah, the TLDR is you need your damage reduction, you need your tank, you need your inspiration giver, and then you need to find in your account the best balance of physical and magical that will work. You also need to keep in mind the meteors and their restrictions. And I recommend messing around with that. The timings, if you're using Furcy, may be slightly different. If you're tossing in a Carnelian, that would probably make the job somewhat easier. But that is really the base idea behind this. And the rest is just gear. Gear, gear, gear. This is endgame content. Not, you know, I just cleared Gear Raid 321 and I can now hit bosses. You're just gonna die. Which is good, right? Because again, there needed to be something that served a purpose in terms of power creep, and this is it. Kigiri and Wukong now actually have a place where they're, I'm not going to say useful because that would be overkill, but there's actually PvE content where they're not totally overtuned, because the content in itself is pretty rough. But yeah, this is it gives something to strive for. So I guess really what I'm trying to say is don't get frustrated that you're not really going far on Abyss 1, and just ignore it for now. It's a bit like when you were hitting Nightmare 2 and people were hitting Nightmare 4. It's kind of that jump in difficulty that is not just going to be solved by something super simple or slight gear upgrades. This is going to be solved by pretty substantial gear upgrades, running quads, and I mean left side quads like this. So yeah, really that's the kind of the breakdown on Abyss 1. I will probably, once I find the time, eventually make a text guide on this. It's been a while since I've messed with my GitHub, but I will probably toss one in there because it seems useful, and start listing again which champs are actually relevant as, you know, new stuff is discovered. And I'll be doing some own tests on my own time with my runs to try to see if I can push it further, if I can find different runs that go through at least to the 12,000 shield. But yeah, that's really it. And again, you know, I've said it a few times in a few of my other videos, but I am glad that we have something to look into here, something to actually gnash our teeth and get frustrated against, because we didn't have that. There was no endgame challenge in PvE. There was just do your Nightmare 4 daily, do your GB2 weekly, auto it, and move on with your time. So, yeah. Cheers, and you have a nice one.